Thank you. And I'm also very much looking forward to your comments and feedback. So it will be very open. And I'm not here with a very conclusive evidence of something, but a lot of questions.
Are you over here at the back? Can you hear? Right, yeah.
Okay. So I will just give the title "No More Full Moon Faces," and it's a reference to a quote from one of my students in the focus groups I ran. So I'll give you a little more context with this overview. So I'll give you first a statement of purpose of kind of what I'm hoping to get out of the presentation. I initially, I think we'll talk within the statement of purpose about my research interests, then an overview on Bhutan, and then the specific case study. So why RAG? Why this group? Why did I end up here? I partly came to UCL. I moved to London in part to come kind of soak myself in theories that I felt were abandoned or not discussed at the moment. So I felt they were also relevant. So I'm exploring applying concepts of matriarchy, new definitions, new uses of the term, to share my story, but also to explore kind of the interior dynamics of the transition to capitalist modernity. What are the impacts on self, on body, on daily practice that perhaps are difficult to grasp on a daily basis? And I thought, what better place to do it than Bhutan, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But my objectives also in this talk are to demystify Bhutan, because perhaps when we talk a little bit more in the middle of the presentation about first impressions or the images that come to mind, there's a very cultivated aura around the country, and I would like to question that here. I'd also like to talk about this interest in the developmental niche. It's a term out of kind of psychological anthropology in the US, but also biocultural anthropology, and it's a type of integration I'm trying to do a bit in my work, and I'm learning a lot from RAG also to do that. I'd like to take seriously or materialize the imagination through this work, and maybe it'll come out in the presentation, maybe it won't, and also to politicize beauty, which has already been done, I think, by Kamila's work, and to politicize symbolic communication, which is already done in Chris's work as well. So with that, I'll try for that. So overview on Bhutan. What are your first images or impressions? Just
where is it?
Do you? Oh, anybody else know?
Border.
Sikkim border. Any other impressions?
$200 a day to go there as a tourist.
Cost $200. Very expensive. Yeah.
It's supposed to have a very high happiness index.
Happiness index. Yeah.
Yes.
What else? I'm curious. This is
It has matrilineal inheritance, but I knew that.
matrilineal inheritance.
Slavery abolished in 1958, I think.
58.
Yeah.
Right. That's
They
why they
were-
have feudal.
There's a lot of history that's missing, I think, till, I don't know, 16th century or something. Before that is...
A lot of lore. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very meticulously kept lore. Yeah.
They kept what?
Lore, like folklore, and a lot of oral histories that have been passed down about the origins of Buddhism, for example, in Bhutan.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I'm curious, just as much as you are. What?
They have a monarchy.
Monarchy. Yeah.
And I would understand they're only very recently been introduced to television.
Yeah, TV was
At times it is a limit.
Interesting. Yeah.
for them.
It is a Hindu monarchy, I think.
That's Nepal, or was Nepal,
Oh,
before
yeah.
it became a Maoist insurgency. Yeah.
And it used
Buddhist.
to be an Indian protectorate.
One could argue it still is, but it was never directly colonized. Yeah. Hmm.
And yes, they've had major conflict over language and ethnicity there. That there was a migrant Nepali labour force which has found itself discriminated against, I think, or pushed out of the country.
Exactly. So there's very often this kind of dichotomy or polarization of the image, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm surprised this one didn't come up, but a natural oasis. It's assumed that it's some kind of pristine natural environment. That's a photo from Bhutan when I was there. It really looks like that in parts. This is an image perhaps more speaking to the monarchy and to the consolidation of political power, political control. That's a police officer who's directing traffic, because you don't have traffic lights in Thimphu. You have humans who direct the flow of traffic. So in one gesture, you have an anti-technological movement, as well as absolute control by the police, which is very much felt in the capital city of Thimphu. Then there's this assumption about Vajrayana Buddhism being mystical and idealized. I often hear. And of course, the Lhotshampa ethnic community that was ousted in the beginning of the 80s, end of the 80s and early 90s. One of the largest refugee populations that had to be resettled to third-party countries. The Lhotshampa, so they're of Nepali origins, and different communities from Nepal who were invited in the end of the 19th century to come and cultivate, as you were saying. So there's actually a dichotomy here between what is idealized, romanticized on one side, and what is obviously demonized or seen as authoritarian, and that's something to unpack. As actually, I have a quote here from a modern historian of Bhutan. Perceptions of Bhutan, even in recent years, were imbued with a sense of mystery and contrasting views. While many see Bhutan as a happy country of exceptional natural beauty and cultural exuberance, some held views of Bhutan in less favorable terms as an autocratic third world state. And obviously the truth is somewhere in between. And I'll try to unpack how Bhutan is trying to navigate that. So it was never colonized directly. They're very proud of that. Bhutan is, as you were asking, right here above Northeast India. So Northeast India is actually north of Bangladesh. It's connected by a tiny strip, these 7 states. And Nepal is the Hindu kingdom that was the Hindu kingdom next door. Bhutan is a Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhist state. And this is actually partly disputed between, parts of this are disputed between China and India, Arunachal Pradesh. And even this recently was the site of a clash between China and India. As you can imagine, that bears a lot of tension in mind between 2 very large countries. And that's influenced its modern trajectory as a nation state, especially because it opened its foreign relations only in the mid-20th century. Its political sovereignty is so much based on culture and cultural distinctiveness that every little action you make, or symbolic even action that you make in Bhutan, can be considered almost political, right? It's a very interesting context to think about the importance of cultural autonomy and whether it's even possible. Interestingly, you'll see above is Lhasa, not too far, and the Tibetan region is a huge influence, but also source of conflict with Bhutan, because today it's associated within, at least academic study, as a Tibetan area. So Tibetan cultural study loves to talk about Bhutan as an extended region of Tibet, but in reality they've had quite a bit of political tension and conflict with Tibet in the north as its own empire, right? Because China was not the only empire in this region. So again, modern historians would assert that Bhutan is distinct and that they actually have a history of flight from Tibet, that a lot of nobility in this case and religious lineages have left Tibet. And I wonder if this is part of a tendency in this area, the Himalayan zone, of flight, of what is possible because of the highland nature of this region, what is permitted if somebody comes to tax you as opposed to having to find you. It's much harder in the highlands than it is in the plains. And interestingly, even within Bhutan, there is a legacy of this centripetal and centrifugal force, where you can flee and where you're stuck and you have to pay tax. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So, as somebody put it, he was a filmmaker I met in Thimphu. Bhutan can be seen, and it could be characterized as a very, very friendly North Korea. Very, very, very friendly. I think he used 3 varies. And that is partly a feature of this Raven Crown institution, 1907. The House of Wangchuk took power and unified the country. And you have a sense of the fortified like kingdom, you know, the fortifications that they have. The Zong is both at once monastic and temporal. So it is a really powerful visual symbol of this unification, but it's also an example of the building code. Literally, all buildings have to be constructed under a certain design. And dress as well has been decreed since the 1980s to be required the go, this type of dress, and for women you'll see in a bit.
Michael Aris, isn't that Aung San Suu Kyi's husband?
Yes, was. He was Aung San Suu Kyi's husband.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit deaf.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hard
sorry.
to hear you.
So at the same time as you have political consolidation and cultural uniformity, at least in physical presentation, there's incredible diversity. These are 19 different language groups, and as many ethnic groups as you can imagine, many more. That is also reflective of tremendous geographical diversity. From the subtropical lowlands, you have Lops, the Lokpu speakers. You have the Lepcha, which are also distributed in this area more broadly. The Kengka, who are called the monkey Keng. There are all these types of stereotypes within Bhutan, of course, about these regions. The Bahu Chetri, the Rai Limbu, the Sherpa, the Tamang, also part of the Nepali diaspora here that were then ousted. A lot of them were ousted, but many remain. The temperate midlands, here you have what are called the Nalong. Oh, sorry, you can't see my indicator. Sorry. How do I do that? Can I make it? No. Sorry, the Nepali speaking are here. Lokpu, that's the Lop. The Lepcha are the Kirti, they're an ethnic minority in this region, and they're also in Sikkim. Kengka, they're historically known almost as like monkey Keng because they were hunter-gatherers, or in their past. Now they claim no, we eat rice and millet like everybody else. Then you have so this is the subtropical lowlands, and you have the temperate midlands. The majority are actually from this region. The Sangla speakers are also called Sharchok, and these, along with the Nalong, are the two. They're about like 80% of the population, and both are matrilineal. Both are supposedly matrilocal. A lot of this is changing, and arguably changing less quickly in the eastern region, which is considered backwards, less developed, and really heavy drinkers on this side. This is actually a distinct language group, Bumtang. It had a separate migration, and that's because Bhutan had historically 3 or 4 doorways, if you will, like valleys going north-south. And it doesn't show here, but you'll see it in the geographic map in a second. Then there's a seasonal migration that used to take place in the temperate midlands. In the winter, you would go south to cultivate in the lowlands, and you would come back. And that was made possible because of slavery. Because during conquests southwards, slaves were captured from the Cooch Behar region, so basically people of Indian extraction were enslaved, and they were released, yes, in 1958 by the third king in an attempt to modernize, and I'll talk about that. Alpine highlands, which will be the fringes, but also here the Brokpa, the Dakpa, and the Laka, and there are a few more up here, Lunana. These are basically the border regions, really high altitude pastoralists. And interestingly, some are actually, they have, here they have Ap Jomo, it's a mother goddess among the Brokpa, and there's not a lot of work done on these groups, but they tend to be they're like the exotic locals for the Bhutanese, and they're actually protected. So even to go there, it's almost like a sanctuary. You have to pass certain controls, etc. Your movement is restricted to that region. Religiously speaking, it's not as diverse. The country is officially Vajrayana Buddhist in its constitution, the last country to be that way. 75% of people are Buddhist. These are kind of sensitive statistics, and I don't know what the date is. I think it's 2010, because 23% are Hindu now, but you can imagine if 90,000 people approximately were pushed out. In the 90s, there would have been more. So demography is very sensitive in Bhutan and difficult to come by.
Is that the only minority, the Hindus?
No, there's increasingly a Christian minority, and that you absolutely can't get numbers on because it has to do with conversion. Again, pretty sensitive. I knew quite a few Christians actually on the college campus, but they practice mostly underground. There's an attempt by the present Prime Minister to make overtures towards different religious communities, because technically one order of Tibetan Buddhism is funded officially by the state. That's the Drukpa Kagyu. But that's not the only Tibetan order. And therefore there are other, for example, the Nyingma or the Red Hat. They're like, well, what about us? And they're privately funded, and interestingly, they're also in this backwards area. And we can talk more about that in a bit. So, on one hand, Bhutan is presented often as a Buddhist country, but in reality, animistic, shamanistic beliefs and practices, and I'm quoting here, were later skillfully incorporated into the Buddhist system, which has further strengthened people's relationship with nature through its concepts of interdependence, nonviolence, and respect for life, the sacred landscape, and hidden valleys. This is Karma Phunso, who's a modern historian of Bhutan. So there's this image of a seamless layer of Buddhism being woven on top of shamanistic, animistic practices. And I'll talk a little bit, what are those called? Are those called Bon? Are they called something else? Oops, sorry. And officially there are 20 dzongkhags or regions. I stayed in the east, so we'll get to know a little bit more about this area, although a lot of these students that I worked with are from all over the country, because it's supposed to be a peak of learning. That means they bring people from all over. Sorry, it's here. Tashigang was my major town, and by road it was an hour, a little bit less than an hour from there, the campus, and I'll show you a photo later. The capital city is Thimphu, and by road it takes 2 days travel, so you break the journey in Bumthang on the way before you reach Thimphu. So it's obviously difficult to do like fieldwork quickly, and yeah, I'll talk about the difficulties of that. In this eastern region, as I mentioned before, is an area of interest for me, because they're also known for shifting cultivation, or what's called seri, slash and burn agriculture, which is banned officially by the Bhutanese state. And yet it persists, and it's interesting to think about why, and it's perhaps an item of debate between anthropologists and ecologists, but I wonder if it contributes also to some of the traditions that continue in the East, and the resistance also to development and to industrial agriculture, which is taking place much more in the South, and which was also cultivated very much by this Nepali diaspora, which were brought in as laborers. Immense diversity, high mountains down to almost subtropical lowlands here. You get a sense of the rivers going north-south. These are the 4 doorways that Bhutan was known for as well, 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, I think the 4th is actually Tamang Valley, which is in Arunachal, India, northeast India. This is mostly forest coverage Right now it's about 70%, and the Constitution guarantees 60% forest coverage. Nothing less than that.
How's it enforced?
That's a good question. There's a lot of like community forest management, but yeah, it's debated a lot.
Isn't that the
right
only
now.
place in the world where the amount of forest is in the actual constitution of the country? Fantastic.
Absolutely. And only 8% is cultivated at the moment. But there's a lot of debate about whether the ceiling should be lifted at the moment. And there are plans, I think, by 2020 to go fully organic. I don't know if they're going to make that in agricultural production. Ambitious, and also perhaps at odds with some of their other developmental goals, which we'll talk about. Political timeline. 1616 is actually the foundation of the Bhutanese state. It's quite old. It's the time of unification of what were at that time, you can argue, chiefdoms or kingdoms, but I think they're probably more like kingdoms. I mean, like large landed elites controlling different regions. By Zabdrung Rinpoche, who was kicked out, or he left Tibet, and he is considered a hero and very important line of energy of rulership in Bhutan. And he's still reincarnated, and that's also a source of tension because he's not the same as the king, right? I won't get into that, but it's really interesting. He was reincarnated in five different ways: the heart, the speech, the mind, the body, and something else. And so you diffuse in the next generation authority in a way. It's really difficult to keep track of them. 1907, though, is the date that most Bhutanese recall most fondly. It's the House of Wangchuk reunifying Bhutan, with some assistance from the British, in fact. And this is actually a photo, the first photo taken in Bhutan by Dr. Benjamin Simpson, who accompanied Ashley Eden on the British mission to Bhutan, in which they tried to negotiate some kind of relationship for the doers, because the Bhutanese basically were like, give us back the strip of land that you have encroached on in the south. And there was a misunderstanding. People were throwing stuff at each other. It was kind of tense. And Ashley Eden went back, humiliated, upset, and he said, I'm going to fight for the doers. I'm going to force you to give them to me. And so Bhutan lost its southernmost strip. But the next British representative was very fond of the first king. So it was a very nice, amicable relationship in which the British agreed to pay for that land they took. And that's actually part of the reason why Bhutan has a bursary still to this day from the government of India, which took over this protectorate kind of relationship with Bhutan. 1961, the first 5-year plan was drafted. This is, yes, in a Soviet fashion. They had installed principles of modernization, basically free healthcare and education, in small form. There was not mass education as yet, but the language of instruction was English, interestingly, which makes field work easy in a college, but in many ways it doesn't. And this is also the first visit, 1958, I believe, by Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, from India to Bhutan. It's to cohere the allegiance of the Bhutanese, to extend a branch of friendship, but also to say, you are our ally against China. And this is, again, a reason that it will haunt Bhutan, because they basically have to sign off their ability to negotiate with other governments. So foreign relations are controlled by India, which is a legacy that lasts from the British relationship, actually. 1980s, there's a lot of tension in the region. Sub-nationalist movements, the Gurkha insurgency was a cause for tension, and this is a period of Bhutanization, when there's a crackdown on what is Bhutanese culture, what is the language, what is the dress, what is even the code of decorum. How do you bow? How do you sit? How do you speak? How do you wear your sleeves? These are all codified, and it's actually a 17th century institution. which was reanimated in the 1980s in order to cohere, again, sovereignty based on cultural autonomy, right? It unfortunately led to the expulsion of people who were not happy also with the clamping down on languages. Nepali was actually taught in schools up till this time, and people were very well integrated. In fact, intermarriage was encouraged. There were financial benefits if you married between communities. National highways also facilitated that exchange between communities that were otherwise fully endogamous. 2008, there is a massive shift. The constitution is enacted, and the fourth king abdicates in favor of his son. The fifth king, who is now made a constitutional monarch, and the first parliamentary elections take place. A lot of things happened in between. I'm not going to talk about it, but you can argue a lot of decentralization also took place between the 80s and 2008 in order to prepare for this. And then 2013, second national elections, there was a switch in government, and then the 11th five-year plan was drafted, which is what is in place now. So very young democracy, and I think this, the nature of electoral democracy, especially the sense of competition, has caused new forms of instability about what is Bhutanese. And the media timeline, I'll be quick on this, but 1973, the Bhutan Broadcasting Service was launched. Radio was actually very early in the country. And as you famously pointed out, TV was initiated, one of the last places in the world, by a state in 1999. It started with 87 channels and has whittled down to 40. But you can imagine it's a lot of new images. 2003, mobile telephony was initiated. The first feature film shot fully in Bhutan was in 2003. 2006, the private press was allowed. Bhutan still doesn't do very well on, what is it called, the Media Freedom Index?
Freedom of the press.
Freedom of the Press Index. In 2013, 64% of all households own a TV and 92% a mobile telephone. And it has actually one of the highest online rates in all of South Asia, very rapidly. And that has implications for, again, what it means to be Bhutanese. This is one of the world's smallest and least developed, whatever that means, economies. The GDP is 2 billion, but has very high growth rates. So on one side, it's the smallest economy, but very quickly growing. Foreign aid dependent, but at the same time, it's considered a development success story. It's not participated in the World Trade Organization. So it's trying to like chart a course based on a lot of international development assistance. So think like World Bank, think UN agencies. Major revenue is from hydropower, regulated tourism. Just from 2001 to 2012, tourist numbers went from just over 6,000 in 2001 to over 100,000. So it's still regulated. You have to pay I think more than $240 a day, and that includes, it's inflation adjusted. Yeah. And that includes all of your guide, because you have a guide everywhere. It includes your room and board, your stay, and your travel, I believe, within the country. It does not include your plane fare to and from. So it's like an enforced travel package, basically. And it's one reason that tourist numbers are controlled, but again, that there's a pressure to push that up. Meanwhile, they're trying to source for new sources of revenue, and that's really going to be in higher education. They're trying to push up the youth workforce, and this has implications so much for my study. The labor market basically expanding. Still, 60% of people in the country are farmers, mostly subsistence. And as of the 1980s, any household is not allowed to have more than 25 acres, so there's a ceiling on land ownership. 2012, and of course I don't know what the enforcement is of that. And as of 2012, women are still much more engaged in agriculture than men, 38%. of all women versus 23%. And in the 1990s, the percentage was more like 96% of all women were engaged in agriculture. So rapid transition in gender roles in labor in one generation.
Can I just ask a bit about the land ownership pattern? Okay, no more than 25 acres per household, but I think there are similar laws in India, but there are ways of getting around them.
Absolutely.
So that powerful families are actually large landowners. Does the same apply in Bhutan, or does it actually work out that it's individual household farms?
I don't know, and in fact, I know for sure that in the western part of the country where land prices have skyrocketed, there is consolidation of land. I've heard that, so I would imagine it's like in India. It's easier to enforce in Bhutan because it's such a small country than in India, but I imagine there are many ways to get around it. And it also contributes, as you can imagine, to nuclearization of households. It's much better for consolidation if you can register land with the new couple. That's a great question, but there's somebody else in the room actually who can answer those questions later, maybe, my partner on land ownership. And meanwhile, gender relations. So this is something I'm still working on, this lit review, but I found some fascinating stuff. I have a lot of small case studies. Some of them are quite old, some of them are quite colonial. They're like Indian bureaucrats who are in Bhutan for some post or another, and they're like LOPS, the lost people, things like that. But piecing together more substantive stuff, like Kunzang Choden, she's actually a member of the Bumthang nobility who became a sociologist and was married to an agricultural, or like an agronomist, agricultural technical specialist from Switzerland. And I find her account quite rich because she, by dint of being nobility, had experienced a lot of different regions in the country, and had also experienced a lot of the Tung Valley matrilineal customs before they changed. So just to give an overview first of the historical versus contemporary situation of gender relations. Naming conventions are neutral generally. Pema is can be male or female, but Pema Choden is female versus Pema Dorji being male. So it's the second name that indicates gender, but very often there were actually only one name. Increasingly people have a second name, and now a third name, but it's not inherited. So neither parent gives a name to the next child, and the naming process is often linked to your guru or your rinpoche. It's given, and Frederick Barth has written about how individualistic that naming practice can be, and I almost argue the opposite. I don't know, that's an interesting debate that I'm thinking about. But matrilineal inheritance of land, and actually to this day, 46% of land titles are owned by women. And I say Sharchops and Nalongs to refer to the two dominant ethnic groups. Sharchops, again, are the Easterners. Nalongs are the Westerners. And interestingly, I don't know if so Frederick Barth and Uni Wicken, his wife, the two Norwegian anthropologists, traveled through Bhutan in '89 and published in 1990 on child health. And in their overview, they talked about maternal health, and they talked specifically about matrilineal and matrilocality. And they said, we dispute whether in practice women are able to make decisions about production within the household. I have a quote, I think. She argues, specifically Uni Wicken argues, men are actually the locus of authority, quote unquote, despite female land ownership and agricultural activity. She and Frederick Barth grant that the Eastern Bhutanese, however, might have more equal labor distribution, and they did not spend very much time in the East. So there's a lot of work still to be done on the differences between Sharchop and Nalong. There are very simple marriage ceremonies. It's usually marked only when a woman becomes pregnant. If anything, union is encouraged between cross cousins. Again, between generally among Sharchops and Nalongs as well, but much more with the Sharchops. Again, this changed after the 1960s modernization. Lots of highways introduced movement, and Karma Phuntsho, this modern historian of Bhutan, argues that it actually led to a lot of intermarriage. And that's also a bit the project of modernization, in this case in Bhutan, is to encourage intermarriage. Matril locality is also generally practiced, so you would live near your mother, the woman's mother specifically. And in practice, just to clarify also about the inheritance of property, it's the house, I understand it, that goes to the eldest daughter in several of the case studies that I've read. I don't know if that's practiced across Bhutan. Bomena is a really interesting example of how things have changed. It's a custom that I have a very detailed account of in Jemgang. I don't have the map, but it was the south central part of the country. Jemgang, Dorji Penjor is an anthropologist who is from that region, and he writes about something called night hunting. Has anybody heard of this? Apparently it was on the radio, BBC or something 2 weeks ago. So it's night hunting because it's when men go into girls' houses and they sleep with them, and it's considered predatory. Did you hear the program? Yeah. Today it's considered predatory and patriarchal, and indeed even the college I went to, it was considered a nuisance that college men would arrive in this town, small town in eastern Bhutan, and all of a sudden start to practice bomena, night hunting among local women, including older women, unsolicited. But Dorji Penjor argues that night hunting in southern Zemgang was actually a sexual rite of passage between consenting adolescents in a tight-knit egalitarian community with male, but which has changed because of male rural-urban out-migration. It's now becoming predatory. So it's kind of a good example, perhaps, of something it's difficult to make a judgment about because it's not practiced in isolation. There's an immense amount of movement in the country, again, since the introduction of highways. Yeah, so it's no longer, and he describes quite beautifully the interchange of gestures. There would be a wink, there would be many opportunities for you to express interest, so it was not unsolicited, actually. But obviously has become so when you don't know people coming and going.
And they sort of knew them, did they? They sort of knew each other very well.
Before, definitely. It was, and there were ways of saying no. There were ways of a woman not being like, "Oh, you're confusing me for somebody else. I'm sorry," in the banter. So
Right way to say that.
yes, yeah.
But it would have been in the context of Matril locality, pretty much.
Yes.
So girls wear her tin.
Yes, yes. Southern Zemgang, which is where a lot of interesting bride service cases are as well. And I don't have access to one of the texts. Lam Dorji, I think, is the one. It's a book in Bhutan that I think I took a photo of or something. But there's a few cases of bride service, including up to 3 years. So when the groom who's interested has to show his interest physically by showing up at the girl's house and providing labor and sometimes goods, and then providing, also furnishing the expenses of the ceremony if there is a child. Again, these are isolated cases, at least of bride service that I found. Then Kunzeng Choden writes about mother abundance in Lunse, which is north central. Mother Abundance was the kind of deity of agricultural production, and you would offer her something before every break during agricultural labor. So you would put some food for Mother Abundance, and then you would eat as a group, as laborers. And Jomo is also a mother goddess, and Brokpa, in the Brokpa community that I pointed out in the highlands. But there are many examples also of, there's Riki Krins, who did fieldwork in Western Bhutan in 2004, who argues that the community she observed, they had little dolls in female form with red pigment on the vulva that were molded and used in ritual ceremonies. And she doesn't say where she did her fieldwork, so I don't really know where that was, but that's in the Nalong side. Still matrilineal, but less matrilocal than Eastern Bhutan. Women are in charge of distributing food. That was very clear in Kunzang Choden's book. They're in charge of the granaries, and she happened to be in a very wealthy household. She's talking about her own household. They were in charge of yang, which is like the measurement. That it was very important who carried the measuring devices, and that value was distributed by women. Pamos are, along with Paos, are the healing practitioners, and Pamos are women, Paos are men, and this is a healing tradition that is no longer practiced in many places. And this I heard from Kunzang Choden herself, that because, and this is interesting to think about, because of the institutionalization of Tibetan medicine, which is funded by the state, along with Western or allopathic medicine, you have a diminishing of ritual healers who would have used techniques that look like shamanism, basically, possession, trance, and other ritual offerings to spirits who need to be appeased, often nature spirits. There are often women, and this was often knowledge, according to Kunzang Choden, that was inherited and passed on through aunts, through women. And there's an interesting article by Adam Payne and Deki something on how land was actually not the measurement of power in Bhutan, that it was actually in the monasteries. And for that reason, women who were historically kept out of monastic institutions would have been deeply disempowered. So it actually was a way of ensuring that women stayed stuck to the land. That's their interpretation of matrilocality. And they almost argue that it's progress to have access to markets, because now that's the measure of value. So as the roads expand, value of your land, et cetera, and your produce expands. And we can debate about that, because I'm in portraying this as like a contrast between historical and the contemporary situation. There's a debate going on in Bhutan right now whether what is happening changes basically the institutionalization of education for everybody. That's great. Everyone is excited that women are going to school and doing well in college, but then what? And this has an impact on gender roles, what is realistically being touted as progress and what is actually possible for a lot of women. And her daughter, Kunzang Choden's daughter, Doma Choden Roder, has actually written a very nice dissertation, also in the same college that I taught in, on exactly this problem. What do you do with all of these college graduates who have nowhere to go? They don't have any job market to enter, and yet that is the vision of progress that Bhutan is excited about. So there's a complex transition taking place through modernization. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. And then I've also been reflecting a little bit about the definition of matriarchy that Heidi Gotner Abendroth is proposing, also as Peggy Sende Reeves, also as Peggy Reeves Sende, and man among the Iroquois. have suggested. So could we play with the idea that matriarchy is not obviously the inversion of patriarchy, but that it's gender egalitarianism, hence why I'm interested in RAG as well. Would it look like balanced economic reciprocity, or the economy of the gift, where women are in charge of resource distribution? Would it look like politically, socially a non-hierarchical society of matrilineal kinship? Politically, would it look like consensus-based procedures, where, if anything, there will be a men's sphere of decision-making, but it is not authoritative? And fourthly, that there is not exclusively male divinities, but that there will also be some kind of sacred representation of the feminine. It was something I played with when I was reading this text, edited by Karma Phuntsho, who is the modern historian of Bhutan. Twilight Cultures, Tradition and Change in Four World Communities in Bhutan. And there, I think you could argue maybe in Zemgang, there's an interesting example that could fit. But it's something that one would have to go and visit to find out more, because that's not the intention of these ethnographies. But yeah, it's something to play with. And yeah, this is the context in which contemporary women in Bhutan argue that the country is actually very backwards in gender egalitarianism, because they say we are now transitioning to a system in which power is measured in dollars and income, in political representation, and Bhutan is one of the lowest ratios of women in politics, and there's a reason. It's because women were not historically participating in the Zong, that big fortress that you saw. They're not part of the monastic institutions. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Oh, and Kunzang Choden also argues that the previous situation in which animistic practices flourished, women had prominent ritual and religious positions, but the entry of Vajrayana Buddhism and celibacy particularly meant that women were vulnerable to pregnancy, that's the term she uses, and therefore polluted. And to this day...
How does celibacy lead to pregnancy?
Because of the valuation of celibacy, and as opposed to the vulnerability of becoming pregnant. Celibacy is valued.
Celibacy is valued as ritually powerful. Women getting pregnant can't be ritually powerful.
Because they're susceptible to this pollution of
pregnancy is pollution.
Yeah.
Thanks for explaining.
And to this day, there's actually a term for that pollution. It's called drip. And it's part of the reason why women hesitate to enter hospitals, because they are considered polluting. So on one hand, we have, evidently a lot of female autonomy in healing, in production, in owning the means of production. But on the other side, symbolically, there's a layer of Vajrayana Buddhism that she argues has invited pollution. And this is consistent with the hypothesized origins of egalitarian Bhutanese gender relations that Reiki Krins, this European anthropologist, argues has roots in antecedent matriarchal practices. So there is somebody who actually argued. This is the woman who did fieldwork in Western Bhutan, and I'm not sure where. She doesn't say where. So for me, it seems like there are at least 3 different historical layers of social organization impacting present gender relations. What are quickly called Bon practice or animist practice, then Vajrayana Buddhism, and then the modern Drukpa nation state. But we would need to unpack which is which, because right now there's a confusion between the 3. There's a assumption something is feudal, and not parsing out what it might be pre-feudal. But more recently, Bhutan has become famous for what is considered an alternative development paradigm, gross national happiness. And it was actually a direct response to GDP. And first in the 1970s, the 4th king happened to be coming back from a non-aligned movement meeting in Cuba, and he was caught at the airport in Calcutta, and when asked, what is your gross national product, he said, the gross national happiness of my people is more important than GNP. It was only systematized later, much later, in the 90s, when structural adjustment was taking place in India, and neoliberalism was on the rise. Arguably, Bhutan has tried to cultivate an alternative development paradigm that values well-being over capital formation, and hence the reason why it chaired this UN General Assembly meeting on defining a new economic paradigm, which was published by the Royal Government of Bhutan in 2012. And the Prime Minister, in his opening text, actually argues that the world is in a lurch because of massive ecological destruction, but also deep inequality, and that the only way to move forward would to be talk about the destructive impact of materialism. I don't think he uses the word capitalism, but it's basically I understand, a critique of industrialization, very explicitly, definitely. And definitely critiquing the pursuit of growth as an end in itself. The gross national happiness paradigm is predicated on good governance, sustainable socioeconomic development, preservation and promotion of culture, and environmental conservation. Hence why 60% is covered under the Constitution under forest. That said, this is a product of the latest Bhutanese venture. The government actually hired in 2016 a company called Future Brand to brand the country. This is Brand Bhutan. Natural and pristine environment, vibrant and living culture, nation of G&H, peace and security, reliable and competitively priced energy will form some of the country's unique selling proposition. USP. The country has a USP based on which Brand Bhutan will be developed. That's the Royal Government of Bhutan. And they are seeking to do that by pushing, I think, those same organic products abroad. So you might see them soon here. So on one hand, they're touting gross national happiness. On the other, they're seeking to brand the country. There's a very fine line the country is walking. And these conflicting desires, ends, have repercussions. More and more people now describe Bhutan as a happy country, despite the fact that a large percentage of the Bhutanese live in depressing poverty, and many Bhutanese youth would willingly grasp the opportunity to work in an American kitchen or European warehouse if given the chance. Moreover, none of the existing sources on Bhutan also adequately discuss the seriousness of the sociocultural transformations, which is fundamentally changing the worldview, cultural ethos, and social fabric of Bhutanese society today. So Bhutan is experiencing a really rapid transition to modernity, through globalization, to capitalism as well. I mean, there's a really fascinating ecology in which to study what the impact is on human well-being, because it's a country that claims to care about that a lot. Interestingly, so meanwhile there's a lot of urban growth from migration, huge urban population growth, but as a result of that also a lot of youth employment, substance abuse, and recently suicide, which is something I personally witnessed in the college. So it's a very conflicted image still within the country. So what is causing so much turbulent change if modernization has been so controlled? And I had planned to show this trailer. I don't know if you want to see it, but it shows some footage from Lunse, which is the Dzongkhag, the region with the highest percentage of female-headed households. It's a very famous weaving tradition, which is a source of huge value production because it was used for taxation, textiles, by the state. I don't know if you want to see it, or should I continue?
You shouldn't tempt us if you're not.
I don't know.
What is it? An advert or something?
Yeah, it's the trailer.
Go on.
Now you've got this far.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. How How do
You
you?
should have not let us see that if you didn't want us to watch it.
I know. How do I do it?
Don't know.
Hide presenter screen.
If it won't work, it won't work.
I know. End show.
Sorry.
He's back again.
Sorry, Shivani, I was. Should
Oh, oops.
Quite quiet.
Oops. Yeah, well, never mind. Don't think it's gonna work. Oh, that's terrible because I have another video
I
elsewhere.
Marissa couldn't get hers to work either. We haven't worked out how it
But imagine the worst.
works.
Yeah, well,
Just press enter maybe when you're
Can
on
you
the
not
video.
press enter? Yeah.
it makes me go forward. Yeah. Okay. Well, you can find it on YouTube. It's Kushidara, and it's actually on iTunes as well. But it is about a love story between this woman and a Western journalist, and she's already married to in this case, he's a Kurtop, a man from Kurto, north central Bhutan. And I would argue that it's not actually a love story about the two of them competing for her love. I think there's actually a third actor, and it's the community of women weaving, and that's an opportunity perhaps to explore. So it's not all dark, is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, so case study. I was in Sheripsek College. That's the campus, right there, like the yellow. Can you see on the bottom? This is down there. Is the road to Tashigang. Tashigang is here. And this is a college campus that was built in 1966 by Jesuits as a school. And only in 2003 did it become part of the Royal University of Bhutan, which is very young. It graduates 300 students every year, out of which 66% become civil servants, and the rest work in the private sector or NGOs, or they don't know. So it's about...
Shivani, is it sort of regulated, that 66%, or it's just...
No,
that happens?
it just happens, and in fact I think it's gone down over the years. It's very interesting that that's mentioned online. It's a selling point of the university. Education is still fully publicly funded, but increasingly there is an interest in private colleges, and one was opened in the national capital, Thimphu, and they're competing for the same students. So who gets in the most civil servants wins. So 66% is supposed to be good, but in reality I think it's gone down because the number of graduates is going up, because the government is pushing higher education. So I was interested in coming to Bhutan to study this ongoing market transition, also because it's one of the last countries to initiate TV, but also because I come from another part of the Himalayas. My family is from Kashmir, and it has also a very conflicted image in the international press, either as militant extremists, Islamists, or as a romantic site of Himalayan scenery. And if you grew up in Nehru in India, it would really be like the place for bourgeois romance. That's where all the songs are set. So this is, for me, in a way, like cathartic to go to a part of the Himalayas that managed to preserve its autonomy but is struggling, and to see if it's possible to save something, to preserve something, and if you can do development differently, if progress can be done in a non-capitalist way. Is there a non-capitalist modernity? So I have this fascination for kind of Himalayan autonomy, and also Tibetan peripheries. Jammu and Kashmir, within it has this region called Ladakh, which was also a periphery of Tibet, and they also like resisted really badly. And for that reason, they have a shared cultural layer. Padmasambhava is this 8th century guru who was supposed to have brought Vajrayana Buddhism eventually over here. And then he started on the other side of the Himalayas and he made his way around. And that was the image that you saw, actually, that when everything shut down, briefly, you saw this big guy.
Yeah.
That was Padmasambhava in this matrilineal region, looking over all the women, perhaps, I don't know. And I also had some friends in Bhutan I went to college with. My partner student was teaching in Shirapse, and he said they had an opening, and that's how I ended up living there and teaching there for a year in the media studies department. And this is a video introducing you to the college. Shirapse, the peak of learning, which will... Do you think I can press something here?
Is anyone clever in the room?
So anybody who knows?
Try putting a spell on it if you like.
Is it embedded? I mean,
Yeah, that's the thing.
it is embedded. Can't see why it doesn't work.
Oh, and then it goes... That doesn't change anything, huh?
Does it work on your computer when it's not attached to the...
Yeah.
It works on your computer on its own?
Yes, it has a presentation mode on by default. It doesn't even let me play it normally here. I think it's because of the connection. It makes it go default to presenter mode, and then I can't actually make it play in presenter mode.
Can you go to the internet and just like play it?
Yeah,
YouTube?
let me try that. YouTube.
Yeah, that's the best way to do it.
Shirapse.
Were you thinking of having a tea break some or too long?
Yeah, I'll be done at... Is it working? No. We have sound but not visual, right? I'll be done in like 15 minutes. Is that it? Or we take a tea break for the case study?
Probably, yeah. 10 or 12 minutes would be good.
I don't think it's even going to YouTube. Oh,
Don't worry about it.
okay. So it's just a video of made by one of my students, actually. It then became a promotional material on the website, and it is basically a little ad for why you should come to Shirapse and why it's so excellent. But it also tells you about this this aspiration to be completely modern and combined to tradition. What they understand to be tradition, which is this Driglam Namza etiquette. But so this case study, how it happened. In October 2015, I was invited by some students to come for a field trip. They were teaching media literacy workshops in a local high school, and they wanted me to come along. I accepted. These are the students in their auditorium. It's a central high school. Everybody lives here. They have jumpers, and they come from all over the region to this centralized school. These are my students. They're presenting on how to be wary about political information being presented in the media, be wary of political advertising and media, like food advertising, things like that. But at some point, one of my students started talking about sexuality and relationships between same-sex couples, and basically how there will be new types of gender identity that might be possible also because of media exposure. And I didn't expect that. I wasn't expecting that to come out of a media literacy workshop, especially because homosexuality or homosexual acts are illegal. They're criminalized in Bhutan under a kind of penal code that is inherited from India, inherited from Victorian England. I took the student and I was like, I feel a bit responsible for having been here, but I don't know what you're talking about. Are you interested in gender studies? Would there be some interest in that? And there was. So about 12 students, these are some of them taking a WIFI at a monastery. We started a gender studies reading group of 12 women. Some of the issues that came up in this gender studies group, which was kind of open study. You bring what you're interested in. Some interest was in same-sex couples because they felt because same-sex sexual activity was criminalized in Bhutan, it caused a lot of mental health issues. And indeed, I think there was only recently a study done on that, on suicidality. But we also discussed changing ideas about attractiveness among boys and girls and wondered whether this was because the individuals in question were changing or because society itself was changing. And specifically, the students were talking about disordered eating. What they were describing was like dieting, specifically. That's the term they used. They expressed concern that women were not eating well in college, and remarked that not eating had become popular among young men as well as young women. And at the same time, I started reading recent ethnography by a psychological anthropologist in the National Referral Hospital, Joe Calabrese and Chencho Georgi, who is the first psychiatrist in the country. Joe Calabrese is now my supervisor here, but he reports that the first cases of eating disorders are being reported in the country. Eating disorders, which, if anybody's heard of its etiology, it's generally understood to be white rich women, who are at risk of eating disorders, so much so that up till the 90s it was considered a culture-bound syndrome, bound to Euro-American women. That's clearly not the case, and it brings into question, of course, where is the boundary of culture and what is actually being shared through images. Is it culture or is it ideology? And what does that mean? What does that mean about politically about beauty?
Has he got an eating disorder?
No, but he demonstrates doma. Doma. It's a type of local cosmetic. I'll talk about it. But the themes of the discussion in some of the focus groups that came out of this gender studies group, we talked a lot about body shaping. This interest in really in gymming. So at some point, a few years before I came to Shirapse, which you saw is kind of remote, there was a craze in gymming in Thimphu, in the national capital, and the director of the college said, "Oh, we should have a gym as well. There's a lot of demand for a gym." So they created a gym, and there was a long list of waiting list for membership. Female students shared stories of their friends beginning diets, working out in this gym, trying to maintain their appearance with clothing and cosmetics. And they felt these were not applicable concerns among their mother generation, for whom thinness was not an important feature of the beauty ideal. One participant felt the norms of female beauty had changed so much in her own lifetime, from appreciating this full moon face to disparaging it compared to the Korean features specifically, and she described this kind of thin chin. Fuller, and that's why I wanted to show you this trailer, because there's a nice example of the old paradigm, and it's actually an old story, an old love story that is kind of haunting the couple. So Fuller, I had also a young woman who was much larger than the others, and she said she felt pressure about her weight from peer groups because of social media. But this was something that didn't affect her because she felt her parents had made her feel comfortable enough with her size. Young men also shared concerns about their height, musculature, and clothing style. Male and female students both observed that these preoccupations about body image included also fairness issues, color of your skin, and that's imported through India. And a preoccupation overall with appearance have become more pronounced in college compared to their experience in high school. And when considering why, they said it's really because they felt 24/7 access to Wi-Fi made a difference, which you didn't have in high school. So while there may have been pressure to look a certain way before, it was not possible for you to think about it regularly. And that has to do with mobile telephony in particular. That's not discussed so much in the literature on eating disorders, which considers mostly television. There's also an unprecedented amount of downloading, and so surprisingly it wasn't American television, it was actually Korean television that was very influential among young women, as well as Indian soap operas. They were frequently monitoring appearance on mobile apps like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, and the Chinese WhatsApp WeChat, which was also a source of foreign conceptions of attractiveness, because they were often downloading pirated films as well. And just ethnographically, I noticed there is surprisingly a lot of interest in food. At some point I was polling students on their favorite food, and very simple items invoked a lot of nostalgia, like potato and chili. These were very, it was considered like very rural authentic of you to like potato, and then ema, the chili. That's kind of like a national vegetable. Dieting is associated with asceticism. And this is also found in India as well. But when you restrict food, it's not about maintaining a figure. The end is not related to thinness per se. It's about denying the body, denying the appetite. So it's actually a religious activity, which is at odds with what they're describing.
Are those two things becoming sort of conflated and confused, that it's both attractive and spiritually desirable?
There's an interesting theory, Scott Whitstone. There's like a group of Israeli psychiatrists who argue that there's actually two types of eating disorders. There is actually in the statistical manual, two types of anorexia nervosa. One where you purge, one where you restrict food, binge versus just not eating. And the binging one, they argue, and I would also argue, is newer, and it is. It was only coined in the 1970s, bulimia. But anorexia nervosa is much older, and it has to do with an attempt to control the limits of the body, where you may not have control over your body actually, particularly by women, as a means of regaining control, access what goes in and what goes out. So it's much older, and that has nothing to do with capitalism. But I would argue that bulimia nervosa, which is responsive to this compulsive desire to consume and then purge. How do you then resolve the conflicting messages you receive between consume everything, at the same time maintain a particular figure? And they are at least arguing that it is related to market production. And in this case, there's also a very eerie correlation between GDP growth and the engram and eating disorders. Engram viewer in Google. But I see it as linked actually to the transition to a market economy. Bulimia, binging and purging, and that's also consistent with some of the findings from Fiji and Becker in Belize, where women who are susceptible to purging are typically employed in tourism, and it's because of their employment prospects. So this is kind of the reason why it's attractiveness for a labor market, in a way, ultimately. So there's still a preoccupation with dress and jewelry, so that's not new. There's always been a preoccupation with the kind of clothing one wears, because it's a status of which group you belong to. Doma was it's a stimulant that you chew, also called pan or betel nut, and it's consumed all the way down Southeast Asia and further. And it's also described by Kunzeng Choden as a really beautiful color. It's supposed to stain your teeth in a way that's appealing or attractive. And it's often used to seduce Doma itself. Indian cereals were watched everywhere. I'm just going to conclude. But there's also obviously new access to commodity markets. And in Kanglung, very remote place, you had little shops that were getting supplies shipped in from Bangladesh, from India, and you have therefore much more access to commodities like Oriflame. It's a Swedish cosmetics company that students were going into debt to buy. So really conspicuous consumption in Babylonian style. And of course, I think this is the biggest factor for me, was the new labor market that the students are preparing for ultimately. How are you going to enter a market that doesn't have space for you? Well, you prepare by preparing your body physically. It's part of your CV in a way, and also at the same time, it's a coping mechanism. The questionnaire, I was looking at just testing out some correlations between what are the institutions that are really changing? Is it really the media that causes changing beauty ideals, or is it from peer groups? Is it from family? Because in this more famous case from Fiji, which was also a case of a jump in purging behavior after the introduction of television, it was a combination of family pressure to be small, labor market pressure to be small, and the media pressure. So it's a triple-fold threat. So just to summarize, I didn't find a correlation between family pressure and thin body internalization, thin body ideal internalization. I didn't find a link between peers. But there was a significant correlation between media pressures. This is self-reporting. So it's wise to keep in mind that it's hard to, perhaps even to a questionnaire, to say my parents or my peers make me feel
Yeah, but
I
they
need
come
to be.
from a generation that may not have been affected sufficiently by the media.
Where?
The parents. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's at odds in some ways with the focus group, where I did hear the peers were putting pressure on bigger women to be smaller, but I understand it's because they interpret it very strictly, like peers face to face as opposed to social media. So that's something to be parsed out in future research. I was kind of surprised to find that 35% of these women want their body to look very thin. This was a statement they agreed with, 35%, while 33% don't, do not agree with that statement. 31% feel pressure from the media to look thinner on that indicator. So a third feel pressure specifically from the media, and about 50% report that their ideal figure size is smaller than the figure that they chose for themselves. So you decide.
They choose what is there. They choose what they would be on that scale.
Yes.
What they would like to be.
Absolutely. So you choose what you feel you are, what you think you are, and what you would like to be. Or it's actually specifically what your ideal figure would be.
So does anyone want to be like that one?
That's a good question. I haven't looked at it. I think there. I remember this was like 2 years ago, but I think there was 1 or 2 cases of one. Yeah. So, yeah, just a review of what the thinness schema is. It's basically patriarchal, I would argue, and this is I'm drawing from the psychological literature on this, but women are supposedly, part of this thinness schema is that women are naturally invested in their beauty assets, and this beauty is a woman's principal project in life. Secondly, that a slender, youthful, attractive image is something substantive because it is pleasing to males and it demonstrates to females that one is in control of one's life. And 3, learning to perceive, monitor, and experience yourself as the object of an essentially masculine gaze is an important part of being feminine and beautiful. This, at least in the U.S. psychological literature, is correlated with, when it's internalized, is correlated with dieting, next level disordered eating, next level eating disorders, and that has to do with the set of risks around you. People who are susceptible for because of low self-esteem in the first place, because of social isolation, will internalize and therefore manifest very serious clinical behaviors. And this is something I alluded to earlier, but there's a long cultural history of disordered eating, and it's distinct from the thin body ideal. So there's a separation.
Are you talking about Bhutan now?
No, globally, the cultural history more broadly of disordered eating, feminists have argued is like a way of coping with distress, a kind of a secret way of communicating distress by just stopping what comes into the body. But I've alluded to that kind of earlier in media
I was
effects.
kind of wondering when you want to have a tea break.
Yeah, I'm media
So all you
effects.
care about is tea.
Well, no, but I mean, otherwise we won't have a tea break, we won't have any discussion.
Can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
Because what you're describing here sounds like a microcosm of what's happening in the Western world over the last 30 years. this invasion
Well, sorry, can I intervene here? I mean, it's best to have the questions at a time when we all have any questions, I think. Otherwise, poor Shivani's never going to finish.
Has
Unless-
Shivani finished?
I mean, my own view is that
Let
I'm...
her finish, the lot of you.
Well, it's
Oh,
just
you
that-
bloke, shut up.
well, I'm trying to chair the thing. We normally have a talk, then we have a break, and then we have questions. But obviously, you're in charge, Shivani. If you want to just carry on, you're fine. Go on.
Yeah, let her
Is it okay?
I'll just give up trying to chair in that case.
I'll wrap up in 5 minutes. Sorry. Okay. This is just a review of things that you might already know, but there's a debate about the extent to which media affects body image, and that's a debate also within feminists. In the UK, there was recently an ad that was debated I think in the Tube of a very thin woman, and it's basically I'm arguing that there's clearly something serious to be considered about images, but within a particular ecological context. And all of this work has been done in the US, basically, all of these studies. So it's classically this weird fallacy: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Limitations. But there is literature on the politics of beauty within anthropology. This is Anne Becker, the book I'm referring to on Fiji, 1996. She argues that what was previously the large body type was actually sociocentric. It implied irrelational care by others. Feeding is actually caring. And to deny oneself food is a denial of care, and it means you're socially isolated. But that changed within, she argues, from 1988 to when she went back in 92. There was a rapid change in body norms and purging post-introduction of TV. But I would argue that it's not really the media in that case. There's a broader ecological shift towards wage labor, or tourism in this case, that permits purging to be effective. There's a literature on anthropology of appearance, which observes the diversity of human appearance from things like height, even within hunter-gatherer communities in Africa, by 2 feet, variation in BMI, body mass index, but also cultural adornment. Body modification varies tremendously, and it often implicates things about gender. Globalization has obviously changed beauty ideals, and there's a case study in Belize about how thin body ideal is now promoted because of globalization and beauty pageants. So in order to compete abroad, pageant queens have to match an international standard. So there's an homogenization of beauty that takes place because of obviously a global political economy. And appearance is obviously linked to group membership. This means things like what we wear obviously signals to others our social identity, particularly in the transition to adulthood. Race is another really clear relationship between appearance and group membership, and health status as well. And I've been influenced also on cosmetics as thinking of it cosmologically. What does it imply about the ethical actions that make us human, or the intersubjectivity, what we're communicating, what is understood, what kind of costly signaling are we employing on the body as the original site of symbolic communication, which she calls beauty magic. So I think it's very political how one chooses to modify the body. And a lot of this, why I'm making it drawn out, is because I feel a lot of this is unconscious, or it's done without thinking, and it's done on a daily basis. So we're constantly recreating and potentially uncreating, hopefully, these norms. The ethics of capitalist modernity, I would like to think, can also be undone and through a conscious process of, we can talk about what makes that possible. But so integrating study of the developmental niche, I'm trying to basically talk about the integrate this idea of the single person, age, sex, health, abilities, temperament, which is individualized so much in psychology, and put it in ecological context, right, of global political economy, but also taking in mind all the institutions in between that matter so much, like the college, the family, and the mass media, which is a kind of in-between institution. Yeah. So in conclusion, have beauty ideals changed? Yes, absolutely. It seems previously a beautiful face was compared to the full moon, and the substantial body showed the signs of having eaten. And that meant that, you were cared for actually in the Bhutanese context as well. Increasing wealth has influenced ideas of ideal appearance, and ideas of, and practices of weight control and dieting are new realities. That was consensuated in 2008, and I find the same in 2015 in Sherpse. But is it because of the media? Not quite. I think the internet is an explicit source of new beauty ideals. It's a convenient scapegoat. It's very visual. It's easy to identify. But the college environment itself is an isolated developmental niche, and it arrives at a time when people are cohering adult identity in a way that makes them more susceptible to looking for scaffolding. How do you create an identity? The models are provided to you, in this case through 24/7 Wi-Fi. And finally, women are under pressure to compete in a tiny labor market that the Bhutanese government is oversaturating with high school, college graduates. And the devaluation of food production obviously contributes to that. And there's a huge issue with particularly female youth unemployment in Thimphu, in the big city. And in that time, perhaps it's a coping strategy to diet, to maintain the body, perhaps also like what's going on here. And that's partly the reason why future research, I would like to look, obviously, to parse this data rural versus urban within Bhutan, and that's possible in the data that I collected, to think about whether there's something resilient about women who are still participating in subsistence production, whether that provides them some kind of stability, identity-wise, and where their body would still be useful and not just an exchange in the labor market. And for that, I would also be interested in gathering data here, which I'll be doing this summer, in UCL, in college students. Yeah, and thinking more about social media. That's it.
Is that it?
That's it.